Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I always thought my grandfather's stories were just that, stories. Tall tales spun by an old man who had seen too much war, drank too much whiskey, and lived too many years alone. He'd talk about the old town of Willow Vale, a place he said was swallowed by the earth one night back in '64 without a trace left behind. No records of it remained in libraries, no mention of it was ever made in the newspapers. It was as though the town never existed. When I was younger, I used to roll my eyes whenever he brought it up. But then, in the summer of 2023, I found myself following in his footsteps, into the darkness where those stories began. My grandfather left me his journal when he died, a thin, leather-bound book filled with yellowing pages and hasty handwriting. Most of it was about his time in Vietnam, but near the back, a few pages detailed Willow Vale, along with a rough sketch of the town's layout. It wasn't on any map, and no GPS could locate it, but I figured if anyone was crazy enough to chase after a ghost town, it was me. I always had a penchant for old places, abandoned buildings, and the stories they kept buried. I guess I liked pretending I was some kind of urban explorer. In hindsight, I should have just stayed home. The journal claimed that Willow Vale lay deep within the pine bark woods, about 100 miles from where my grandfather's cabin was. It was a long drive down a stretch of forgotten road, followed by an even longer hike through the dense, misty forest. The air grew colder as I ventured deeper in, and the fog thickened, swirling around me in ghostly tendrils. My cell phone was useless out here. The signal died long before the last paved road disappeared in my rearview mirror. After hours of trudging through the damp underbrush, I found a narrow, overgrown path, just where the journal said it would be. I followed it for what felt like miles, the daylight fading away behind me, swallowed by the thick canopy above. Just as the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, I saw it. The remnants of an old wooden sign, half rotted and covered in moss. I cleared away some of the grime, and there it was, barely visible. Willow Vale. I felt a chill run through me. For the first time, I began to believe my grandfather's stories. I stepped past the sign and into what used to be the main street. The road was little more than a muddy trail, lined with crooked lampposts that leaned like old men on canes. The buildings were still there, or what was left of them. Roofs sagged inward, walls were split and crumbling, and windows, broken and clouded with grime, stared vacantly out onto the desolate town. There was a silence here, thick and oppressive, as though the whole world had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. I felt as though I was trespassing in a place that time itself had abandoned. The first building I came to was a general store. The door hung off its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. I stepped inside, and the floor groaned beneath my weight. Dust coated everything, a thick, heavy layer that seemed undisturbed, almost as if the entire town had been sealed off from the world for decades. There were shelves filled with rusted cans, ancient newspapers scattered across the floor, and a cash register that still had a few coins resting on the tray. It was as though the people had left in the middle of an ordinary day and never returned. I moved deeper into the town, curiosity drawing me onward, but the further I went, the stranger things became. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds in the trees, no insects buzzing in the thick air. Even my own footsteps seemed muted, swallowed up by the heavy silence. As I wandered past a dilapidated church with shattered stained glass, I heard something, a whisper carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, echoing from somewhere further up the street. There was a shiver in the air, a subtle, inexplicable shift that set every hair on my body standing on end. I found myself walking toward the sound, even though every instinct screamed for me to turn back. At the far end of the town was a large, two-story house, one that had probably belonged to the wealthiest family in Willowvale back in its prime. It was in better shape than the other buildings, though the paint was peeling and one of the windows was broken. The whispering grew louder as I approached, no longer just a faint murmur, but a voice, clear, distinct, and undeniably real. It was calling my name over and over from inside the house. I should have left right then and there, but something compelled me to go inside. I pushed open the door, which swung inward with an eerie ease. The interior was dim, the light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. The air was thick with a musty, decaying smell. As I moved through the darkened halls, the voice seemed to lead me up a staircase, down a narrow corridor, and into a room at the end. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished. An old bed frame with a rotted mattress, a wooden dresser covered in dust, and a cracked mirror on the wall. In the corner of the room was a small, wooden rocking chair, and there, sitting in it, was a figure, a woman, gaunt and ghostly, her eyes sunken and skin pale as if she had been drained of life itself. She was dressed in a faded white gown, the fabric stained with dirt and something darker. She stared at me with hollow eyes, and then, in a voice that sounded both near and far away, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to retreat, but the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in the room with her. The woman's expression changed, her vacant gaze transforming into one of dreadful sorrow, and she spoke again, her voice trembling with despair. "They took us, all of us, and now, you." Before I could respond, the room seemed to shift around me. The walls rippled, the air thickened, and I felt a terrible pressure squeezing in on my chest. The light dimmed further, until the only thing I could see was the woman's face, her eyes growing wider and darker. Suddenly, the entire house seemed to vibrate with a low, ominous hum, and the voice, no longer a whisper, but a chorus, filled my ears. It was not just one voice, but many, layered over each other in a cacophony of torment. And then I saw them. Figures began to materialize in the room, emerging from the shadows like wraiths. Men, women, and children, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and agony. Their eyes were empty, hollow sockets, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out toward me, their hands clawing at the air, as though they were trying to pull me into the darkness with them. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing closer and closer until I could feel the breath of those phantom voices on my skin. I don't know how I found the strength, but I turned and rammed the door with my shoulder. It burst open, and I stumbled out into the hallway. I could hear the whispers growing louder behind me, the voices pleading and accusing all at once. I bolted down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the front door, it flew open of its own accord, and I didn't stop running until I was well beyond the town limits. The broken sign, a distant speck behind me. The fog swallowed up the town once more as I fled. I don't remember how I found my way back to the road, only that when I finally reached my car, I felt as though I had been running for hours. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, the engine coughing to life. I sped away from Pine Bark Woods, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I returned home, I tried to look up Willowvale again, desperate to find any mention of it, anything that could explain what I had seen. But as always, there was nothing. No records, no maps, nothing. The journal was the only evidence I had, and even then I found myself questioning its authenticity. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress? But then, as I was unpacking my backpack, I found something that wasn't mine. A small silver locket tarnished with age, with the initials EH engraved on the back. I don't know how it ended up in my bag or who it belonged to, but I knew one thing for certain. Willowvale was real, and whatever happened there hadn't ended. It was waiting, hidden away in the depths of the woods, drawing in the curious, the lost, and the foolhardy. It was a place that had been forgotten by the world, but not by those who had perished within its grasp. I'm leaving this story behind as a warning, for anyone who might come across it and think that my experience was just another tale spun to scare the gullible. If you find yourself near Pine Bark Woods and you hear a whisper calling your name, I implore you, run. Run far, far away and never look back, because Willowvale may be forgotten, but it is far from vanished. Some things you can walk away from, others follow you home. I learned that the hard way. It was a Friday night in late October, and I was sitting alone in my quiet apartment, mindlessly scrolling through horror forums for any good paranormal stories. Halloween was close, and as a big fan of the supernatural, I was in the mood for something that might actually make my skin crawl. But after reading story after story, I was still unmoved. Most of the tales seemed like predictable campfire ghost stories. I was about to call it a night when a new post caught my eye. "This is not a ghost story," it read. "This is something much worse." I felt my heart race a little as I clicked on it. The writer didn't start with an elaborate build-up. He got straight to the point. He described an encounter with a demonic presence, something inhuman that had stalked him for weeks. "This thing knows me," he wrote. "It watches, it waits. I've tried to get rid of it, but the more I ignore it, the closer it comes." The account was chillingly believable. He'd included small details, things that felt specific enough to be true. The cold air in his room, the sense of being watched even in the brightest light, the way he would hear his name whispered from dark corners. But what disturbed me most were his warnings. "If you feel something staring at you tonight, don't look back. And whatever you do, don't speak to it." As I read, my apartment suddenly felt colder. I glanced around the room, wondering if my own imagination was getting the better of me. The shadows seemed thicker, darker, as if they were creeping closer. Then the lights flickered. For a moment, I froze, listening to the silence that seemed to deepen around me. I shook it off, blaming faulty wiring. But as I looked back at my screen, the post had changed. The forum was now showing a message that read, "This user has been deleted." I felt a strange pang of disappointment mixed with relief. It was a good story, even if it wasn't real. I logged off, shut down my laptop, and tried to brush off the lingering feeling of unease as I prepared for bed. Around 3 in the morning, I awoke to an intense, overwhelming pressure on my chest. My room was dark, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a strange shadow in the corner, darker than the rest of the room, as if it was absorbing all the light around it. It looked like a figure. I tried to shake off the remnants of sleep, thinking it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the shadow didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to shift, almost as if it were aware I was watching it. My heart began to race, and I felt the skin on my arms prickle with goosebumps. Then, the shadow moved. I felt frozen as it drifted toward the side of my bed. I could almost make out a face within the darkness, twisted, contorted, with eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. I tried to scream, but the weight on my chest kept me paralyzed. I remembered the warning from the post. "Don't look back, don't speak to it." But it was too late. I'd already looked. The figure leaned closer, and I felt a wave of suffocating cold wash over me. Its voice was barely a whisper, but I heard it echo in my head. "I've found you." The next day, I woke up with no memory of falling asleep, just an ache in my chest and bruises around my neck that I couldn't explain. My mind raced as I tried to remember the events of the night before. Had it been a nightmare? It felt too real. I touched the bruises, feeling the tenderness, and chills crawled down my spine. I tried to shake it off, blaming stress or maybe sleep paralysis. But as the day went on, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan in my apartment, flinching at shadows that seemed to shift at the edge of my vision. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me as if something was watching. Days turned into weeks, and the occurrences only got worse. Every night I'd hear whispers, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Sometimes I'd feel a cold touch on my arm, or a faint sickly sweet smell would waft through the room. I'd feel a strange, unshakable dread, like something was standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up at the mirror. The face staring back wasn't mine. Its eyes were pitch black voids, and its mouth was twisted into a sinister smile. I stumbled back, crashing against the wall, and when I looked again, it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had been staring out from inside me. I finally reached out to a priest I knew from my childhood. I was desperate, and I hoped he might offer some kind of reassurance or advice. He listened quietly as I described everything that had happened, his expression growing darker with each detail. "You need to understand," he said gravely. "Demons aren't ghosts. They don't haunt places. They haunt people. And once they latch onto you, it's not easy to break free." I felt a chill as his words sank in. I asked him if he could help, if there was any way to get rid of it. He nodded but warned me that it wouldn't be simple. He gave me some holy water and told me to pray every night, to fight against the darkness that had attached itself to me. I followed his advice, clutching the bottle of holy water every night as I whispered prayers, my voice trembling. But the presence didn't go away. It only grew stronger, more invasive. My dreams turned to nightmares, vivid and twisted. I'd wake up in strange places in my apartment with scratches on my arms and bruises that appeared overnight. One night, I awoke to the sensation of hands pressing down on my shoulders, pinning me to the bed. The shadow figure was there again, looming over me, its face inches from mine. Its breath was cold, reeking of decay, and its voice echoed in my mind. "You invited me. You cannot make me leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt my strength drain as the figure pressed down, a weight like iron holding me in place. I remembered the words I'd read that night on the forum. "If you feel something staring at you tonight, don't look back." But it was too late. I had looked, and now I couldn't turn away. Weeks turned into months, and I was a shell of my former self. My friends and family noticed the change, the hollow look in my eyes, the dark circles that no amount of sleep could erase. I tried everything, prayers, rituals, sage, even moving to a new apartment. But it followed me, lurking just at the edge of my vision, waiting for the darkness to settle so it could draw closer. One night, in a fit of desperation, I screamed into the void, "What do you want from me?" For the first time, I received an answer. "Your fear, your pain, your soul," it whispered, its voice chillingly clear. "I want all of you." I broke down, feeling utterly defeated. I'd brought this on myself, all because of my curiosity, my need for a thrill. Now I was paying the price. It's been nearly a year since that night. I've learned to live with the thing that follows me. Some nights are better than others. There are times when I feel almost normal, when the shadow stays hidden, but I know it's there, lurking, waiting. I don't read horror forums anymore. I don't seek out ghost stories or paranormal tales. I know now that some things are better left unseen, better left unheard. Because once you invite them in, they never really leave. So if you're reading this, take my warning seriously. Some things aren't meant to be found, and if you feel something watching you from the darkness, don't look back. Trust me, you don't want to see what's waiting. The ocean's endless horizon stretched before me, deceptively calm, while an unsettling chill snaked through the air. I should have felt excitement, standing on the deck of the Calliope as we sailed into the Bermuda Triangle, but all I could feel was a gnawing sense of dread. This place had a reputation, and even though I wasn't superstitious, I couldn't shake the stories, the ships and planes disappearing without a trace, the compasses spinning wildly, the eerie lights in the sky. Those tales seemed ridiculous, but as the last glimmers of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I couldn't help but wonder, what if they were true? We were a small research team out to collect data on magnetic anomalies. Dr. Grant, the lead researcher, was a man of science, his mind unshakably grounded in reason. For him, the triangle was just another patch of ocean. A mysterious one, yes, but nothing supernatural. He wasn't alone. My fellow crew members all had similar views, and their excitement about the scientific potential of the trip was contagious. At least it had been, until we reached these waters. That night, a strange mist settled over the ship, thick and unnatural. We'd only been a few hours inside the triangle, and everything was already off. The mist clung to us, moist and clammy, pressing in from every direction. It seemed to muffle sound, swallowing the usual oceanic noises so that all I could hear was my own nervous breathing. I didn't know if I should laugh at myself or if I should be genuinely concerned. Around midnight, we lost power. I was in the engine room when it happened, checking on some of the equipment when suddenly the entire place went dark. A low hum filled the room, almost vibrating the floor beneath me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, as shadows seemed to thicken in the corners. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling a little foolish. "Nothing." I took a step forward, listening. The engine was still there, just as I'd left it, but something felt wrong. I had this prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and turned it in a slow circle around the room. The light revealed nothing unusual, but when I glanced back at the door, there was something on the other side. A figure. Vaguely human-shaped, it seemed to ripple and dissolve into the mist like smoke in the wind. "Did you see that?" I blurted, hoping someone would answer. Silence. Moments later, the lights flickered back to life, bright and sudden. My head jerked to the spot where I'd seen the figure, but there was nothing there. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding. The next morning, things got stranger. Dr. Grant was missing. We searched the ship from top to bottom, scouring every room and even checking the lifeboats, just in case he'd taken one out on some bizarre solo experiment. But there was no sign of him. His cabin was untouched, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. The team was shaken, and as the hours stretched on without any answers, the atmosphere on the ship grew tense and fearful. It wasn't just Dr. Grant's disappearance that was troubling. It was the compasses, too. They spun aimlessly, like broken toys, pointing in every direction except north. The radios had gone dead, and none of our satellite equipment seemed to work. No one wanted to admit it, but we were stranded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the ocean lapping against the hull, but even that sounded strange, like a whispering voice just on the edge of hearing. I told myself it was the stress, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept replaying what I'd seen in the engine room, a trick of the light maybe. But as I lay there, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't the sea. It was a voice, a low, murmuring voice that sent chills down my spine. "Come, down." I bolted upright, heart pounding. The voice seemed to be calling from below deck, a faint yet insistent lure. I was about to shake it off when I heard footsteps outside my door. They were soft and slow, moving down the hallway, as if someone were pacing. Holding my breath, I opened the door a crack, peering out. A figure was walking down the corridor, moving toward the engine room. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. It was Dr. Grant, or at least it looked like him, but his movements were stiff, unnatural, as though he were being guided by invisible strings. I called out to him, but he didn't stop, didn't even turn around. Instead, he disappeared around the corner. I followed, barely thinking. Every step I took was punctuated by the frantic beat of my heart. As I rounded the corner, I saw him enter the engine room. I dashed after him, but by the time I got there, the room was empty. He was gone. I stood there, feeling the hairs on my neck rise. The hum was back, stronger now, and with it, that thick, creeping mist. It poured from the walls, gathering in coils around my feet. "Come down," the voice murmured again, insistent and cold. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I felt drawn, compelled to follow, as though invisible hands were tugging me forward. I wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the crew, but something was pulling me deeper into the engine room. The hum grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, filling my head with a droning, monotonous chant. And then, beneath the engine, I saw it. A trapdoor, hidden by a loose metal plate. It looked ancient, much older than the ship itself. My hand trembled as I reached for it, fingers brushing against the cold metal. Before I knew it, I was lifting it open. A ladder descended into darkness, and that voice, now a chorus of voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, rose from below. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I climbed down into the depths. The space beneath the ship was vast, impossibly large for what should have been the hull. Shadows swirled around me, taking shapes and then dissolving like nightmares half-formed. I stumbled forward, the floor sloping downward, leading me deeper into this hidden chamber. In the dim light, I saw them, faces, dozens of them, staring from the walls. Their eyes were wide, empty, mouths open in silent screams. They seemed trapped, as if the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. Among them, I recognized Dr. Grant. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a plea for help. I took a step back, my heart racing, but the walls began to close in, the faces pressing closer. They whispered to me, voices blending into one endless, insistent command. "Stay with us." I turned to run, but the mist thickened, wrapping around my arms and legs, holding me in place. The faces drew nearer, their mouths stretching wider, as though ready to consume me. Panic surged through me as I fought against the unseen force, desperately clawing my way back toward the ladder. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free, stumbling up the ladder and slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. The whispers faded, but I could still feel them, lingering in the corners of my mind, like a dark stain I'd never wash away. When I finally made it back to the main deck, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The mist had lifted, and the ocean stretched out before us, calm and innocent, as if nothing had happened. But Dr. Grant was gone, and I knew I couldn't tell the crew what I'd seen. They'd never believe me. We drifted out of the triangle later that day, our instruments suddenly working again, our compasses pointing north. No one mentioned Dr. Grant after we made it back to shore. The official report listed him as lost at sea, a tragic accident. But I knew the truth. Some nights, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I can still hear the whispers. They linger at the edge of sleep, voices calling from beneath the waves, beckoning me back. I should have known better than to look too closely. But that's the thing about mirrors. They dare you to confront what you don't want to see. It began on a Tuesday night, alone in my apartment. Rain pattered against the windows, and a heavy fog pressed against the glass, swallowing the city lights. I'd always hated the apartment's endless row of mirrors, each one reflecting a stretch of my home, until it seemed like I was living in a maze of my own making. I'd cover them if I could, but the landlord insisted on keeping the aesthetic. It was his artistic vision, he said. And every night, those mirrors grew darker. Tonight, they felt worse. They didn't just reflect me back, they seemed to observe me. An itch I couldn't scratch crept under my skin as I moved from room to room, catching glimpses of myself, a flicker in the bathroom, a shadowed outline in the living room. Every reflection seemed slightly off. A chill settled over me, and I avoided eye contact with the mirrors as much as possible, telling myself it was all in my head, until I noticed the footprints. They were faint at first, smudges on the glass, the size of children's feet trailing from mirror to mirror. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but the smudges grew clearer, appearing in different rooms faster than I could get to them. Each step felt fresher, closer, until I heard faint scurrying footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just me, or rather my reflection. It was smiling, not the kind of smile I would give. This was darker, stretching across its face like a rip. My own mouth wasn't moving, yet there was this twisted grin in the mirror, like it was holding a secret I didn't know. I backed away, feeling my pulse hammering against my skin, but every mirror I passed showed that same smile, a widening, grotesque grin that grew darker, more sinister, the further I walked. Then just as quickly, the reflection went blank. No smile, no movement, just a pale face staring back, my own eyes wide with fear. A low, grating voice echoed from the hallway. "You shouldn't have looked." I felt my stomach turn cold, and I glanced back at the mirrors lining the walls. They were warping, bending in ways that glass shouldn't bend. The reflection twisted, blurring, and then I saw it. Me, but not me. My mirror self began to move, pressing its hands against the glass, leaning closer until it seemed like it was just an inch away from breaking through. I backed away, eyes wide, heart pounding as I stumbled toward the door, fumbling for the handle. But every mirror was alive now. Each one showed my twisted reflection moving closer, pounding on the glass, mouths open in silent screams. They were trying to get out. Then, one did. With a loud crack, the glass of the hallway mirror shattered, and someone stepped out. It was me, yet it wasn't. My face was sunken, pale as the fog outside, eyes empty and hollow. My doppelganger moved slowly, deliberately, stretching its fingers as if savoring each movement. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The mirror me tilted its head, eyes narrowing, studying me with a cruel, hungry smile. "You don't belong here," it hissed, its voice a hoarse whisper. "I do." The room felt like it was shrinking, every shadow closing in. My other self was close enough now that I could feel its cold breath on my face. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and ran into another mirror. But instead of seeing my terrified face, I saw another version of me, older, with darkened, hollow eyes, fingers reaching through the glass. The room spun, and I realized I was surrounded, not just by reflections, but by versions of myself, every mirror showing a different, monstrous rendition, each one more twisted, more wrong than the last. My first instinct was to run, but as I turned, I noticed the hallway had stretched. A thin, darkened corridor extended into a pitch-black void, the walls lined with mirrors on either side, each one a twisted portrait of me. I took a step forward, compelled by a strange, haunting pull, each footstep echoing against the darkness. The mirrors flickered like a row of dying lights, each one showing different fragments of my life. A childhood reflection laughing, an adolescent me with bruised knuckles, a version of me in my 20s staring blankly into the mirror with a hollow look. It was as if each reflection was reliving its own story, unaware of me watching. Then they all turned, every reflection in sync, staring straight at me. "Come with us," they whispered in unison, voices blending into a symphony of despair. "You belong in the mirror." A cold hand gripped my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just a mirror, reflecting the terror on my face. But in that reflection, my hand was reaching back, grabbing my own shoulder with a malicious grin. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." "It's as real as you are," my reflection said, stepping closer, eyes dark and hollow. "Real enough to take your place." I stumbled back, but every step only brought me closer to another mirror, another twisted version of myself. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to find an escape, but there was none. The mirrors began to close in, like a wall of glass pressing from all sides, each image sneering, laughing, reaching for me. And then, silence. The mirrors cracked, splintering as if they were under some terrible pressure. My own reflection grinned, its eyes widening as it clawed against the glass, its fingernails bleeding as it fought to reach me. I could hear the scrape of nails against glass, the shriek of shattering mirrors as each version of myself tried to break free. But it wasn't me trapped in the mirrors. They were trapping me. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, the weight of glass pressing down, suffocating me as my vision blurred. My hands pressed against the surface of the mirror, but they felt heavy, unresponsive. On the other side, I saw my own reflection, my real reflection, not the twisted version that had broken free. It smiled back at me, pity in its hollow eyes. "You're one of us now," it whispered, before fading into the darkness, leaving me alone in the glass. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't exist in a mirror. My world is cold, silent, a prison of glass where every face is my own, twisted, laughing, taunting. I can see my apartment, my old life, just beyond the glass. Sometimes I catch glimpses of people on the other side, but they don't see me. They never see me, but every now and then, someone catches my reflection. Just a flicker, a flash of movement, and for one terrifying moment, they see me, trapped, screaming silently, begging for someone, anyone to set me free. But they never look for long. After all, no one wants to see what's hiding in the mirror. I heard the first scratch on a bitterly cold December night. It was faint, like the slow drag of a nail against wood, and it seemed to come from right above my bed. Groggy and half asleep, I dismissed it as a fluke. After all, the old Victorian house I'd recently moved into had a tendency to creak and settle with the wind. But by the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was off. The house had come cheap. Dirt cheap, actually, given the massive amount of space. I'd inherited it from my uncle, an eccentric man I barely knew, whose final years were spent in seclusion. No one ever visited him here, and I'd rarely even thought of him until his lawyer called me. He'd left it to me, free and clear, just like that. The only problem was that I quickly found out why the place had such a lingering shadow over it. That scratching wasn't a fluke. It returned each night just as I lay down, and grew louder with each passing evening. Soon, I began to notice subtle changes in the attic itself. I'd go up there to investigate, finding footprints in the dust, large, too large to belong to any creature I knew. Worse, I began to notice strange, musky odors, as though something lived up there, something feral, something that belonged in a damp cave, not an attic. One night I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with only a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, my heart pounding with each creak of the steps. As I reached the top, the hairs on my neck prickled. The smell was overwhelming, thick, cloying, like rotting leaves mixed with something pungent I couldn't quite place. I aimed the beam of light into the darkness. My breath froze as I caught sight of the attic floor. The dust was disturbed, but in no ordinary way. Long, sweeping trails cut across the floorboards, as if something large and heavy had dragged itself through the shadows. But it wasn't just the marks that froze me. It was the strange, almost claw-like shapes that dotted the floor, like tracks from some massive, unknown animal. Then, I saw it. Just for a split second, a dark shape hunched over in the far corner, too fast for me to make out its exact form. It vanished, retreating into the shadowed beams of the attic, like it knew how to evade the light. I stood frozen, feeling a sinister, watchful presence lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. And then I heard it, a guttural hiss, deep and vibrating, like the sound of something utterly alien. The next morning, I called an exterminator. I didn't tell him exactly what I thought I'd seen. I just said I had a pest problem. He was a burly, confident guy named Ted, the kind who seemed more suited to wrestling bears than fumigating houses. But when I led him up to the attic, his bravado faded fast. Ted turned on his flashlight, peering around in silence. I watched his eyes narrow as he took in the drag marks, the claw-like impressions. He didn't say much, but after a quick inspection, he turned to me, his face pale. I'll need to get some additional equipment. This might take a while. He never came back. Days went by, and I called his office, but no one answered. The scratching in the attic grew louder, more insistent, almost as if it were trying to taunt me. And that smell, the musky, rotten scent, grew stronger. I tried to ignore it, convinced myself it would pass, but the gnawing dread in my gut only grew. One night, I heard a thud, heavy and unmistakable, followed by a long, slow scraping sound. It was as though something was dragging itself down the hallway just outside my room. I gripped the sheets, listening to the slow, deliberate rhythm, too petrified to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence flooded the house, leaving my ears ringing. I lay there, my body locked in fear, unable to close my eyes, just waiting for something, anything to happen. The next morning, I woke with a sick feeling gnawing at me. I went back to the attic, hoping against hope that whatever was haunting my nights had finally gone. I stepped in, heart thudding, my flashlight trembling in my grip. But as soon as I entered, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows shifted, pulling my gaze toward the far corner. And then I saw it, clear as day. A creature hunched low, almost humanoid but twisted in a way that defied logic. Its skin was stretched tight over a bony frame, its eyes a sickly yellow that glowed even in the dim light. The thing hissed, a sound so low and primal that it rattled through my bones. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting frantic beams of light across the creature's grotesque form. It slithered toward me, its limbs moving at unnatural angles, each movement accompanied by a sickening crack. I screamed, scrambling backward, but I felt its breath on my face, hot and rancid. Its eyes bore into mine, filled with a terrifying intelligence. I knew then it had been waiting for this moment. Somehow, I managed to bolt down the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The scratching resumed with a vengeance, accompanied by a low growl, echoing through the walls. I knew I couldn't stay. The house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to it. Whatever bargain my uncle had struck to keep this creature contained had failed, and now it was loose. Its home was no longer the attic. It had claimed the whole house. On my final night there, as I packed my things in a hurry, I heard its footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. I didn't look back as I raced out the front door, slamming it shut behind me, as if that flimsy lock could keep the creature at bay. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it lurking in the shadows of my house. But there was nothing, only an empty window watching me leave. I never returned. The house stands empty now, the for sale sign faded and broken. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries a certain chill, I swear I can still hear the scratching, as though it's calling me back, waiting for the moment I'll return. I can't forget the sound. It echoes even now, years after I left that place. A deep, guttural groan like the house itself was crying out for mercy. But it wasn't just a house. It was something else entirely. A presence that seemed to watch, waiting for its next victim. And that night, it nearly got me. I was 24, fresh out of college, and desperate to start my career as a historian. My first real job came as a research assistant for a small local historical society in New England. My supervisor, a gruff, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor, assigned me to the Holloway house. Perched on the edge of town, high up on a hill that seemed to be in perpetual shadow, the house had been abandoned for decades. Its crumbling stone walls and shattered windows, an eerie reminder of its tragic past. Legend had it that Holloway House had claimed the lives of every family who'd lived there. People spoke of disappearances, violent deaths, and whispers from the walls. Locals called it the House on the Hill, refusing to utter its true name. I didn't believe in any of it, at least, not at first. It was just an old house after all. My job was simple: gather what I could from the building itself and piece together its history. The first time I stepped inside, an unnatural chill seeped into my bones. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and shadows stretched across the walls as if they were reaching for me. I shook it off as nerves. The house smelled of mildew, dust, and something else. An earthy, damp scent, like freshly turned soil. My task that day was to examine the main floor. As I moved from room to room, the oppressive quiet settled heavily over me. Every creak and crack felt magnified, as if the house was straining to contain itself. I was halfway through cataloging a faded tapestry in the parlor when I heard it, a faint scraping noise just outside the room. I froze, heart pounding, straining to listen. Silence. I took a shaky breath and resumed my work, but the sense of unease lingered. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and a feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. It took everything I had to stay focused and finish my work for the day. I told myself it was just an old, empty house. But as I walked down the hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching me from one of the shattered windows. A few nights later, Eleanor called me, her voice brisk and businesslike. "I need you to go back," she said. "We missed the basement. I think it holds some valuable records." I hesitated. The thought of going back to that place, especially alone, made my stomach turn, but I couldn't say no. So, the next day, armed with a flashlight and my notebook, I returned to the house. The basement was worse than I'd imagined. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and as I descended, the air grew colder and denser, as though I was descending into a tomb. My flashlight revealed stone walls lined with crumbling shelves, their contents shrouded in dust. And then I saw it. A massive wooden door at the far end of the room. Heavy iron bolts locked it shut, and symbols were scratched into the wood. Strange, ancient symbols that I didn't recognize. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and a deep sense of dread filled me. I turned to leave, but a soft whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it, drifted through the darkness. "Help me." I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly. Nothing, just empty shelves and shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination and forced myself to focus. But as I turned back toward the stairs, something stopped me in my tracks. A faint, bloody handprint smeared across the wall beside the door. It hadn't been there when I came down. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run. The whisper came again, louder this time, pleading. "Please, help me." I took a step forward, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled, as if some invisible force was guiding me. My hand brushed against the iron bolts, and a searing pain shot through me, so intense that I stumbled back. The whisper turned into a low, guttural growl, filling the room with a primal rage. I bolted for the stairs, the growl growing louder, more insistent. My feet pounded against the creaking wood, but the basement seemed to stretch, each step leading me further into darkness. Finally, I burst into the main floor, gasping for breath, heart racing. I slammed the basement door shut, the growl silencing instantly. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, when I felt it. A faint, icy hand resting on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty, decaying hallway. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my flashlight. The walls seemed closer than before, shadows creeping, folding inward. And then, down the hallway, I saw him. A figure stood in the doorway of the parlor, his face hidden in shadow. He wore old-fashioned clothes, his shoulders hunched, head cocked to one side as if he were listening. I felt his gaze pierce me, though I couldn't see his eyes. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I saw his face. Pale, sunken, with hollow, empty eyes. His mouth twisted into a chilling smile, revealing rows of broken, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose floorboard and landed hard on my back. When I looked up, he was gone. The hallway was empty, silent. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, rushing toward the door. But just as I reached it, it slammed shut in my face, a cold wind swirling around me. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. "Help me, help me." I covered my ears trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent. Shadows twisted and writhed around me, forming ghastly, nightmarish shapes. I closed my eyes, praying it would all stop, that I'd wake up and realize it was just a dream. Suddenly, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, and I was alone in the empty hallway. My heart pounded as I slowly opened my eyes, my gaze falling on the basement door. It was ajar, the darkness within beckoning. Against every instinct, I approached the door, something compelling me forward. The whispers returned, softer now, pleading, desperate. "Please." I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I stepped forward, the darkness swallowing me whole. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in. The town never found out what happened that night. My friends, my family, they searched, they questioned, but Holloway House kept its secrets. The locals still whisper about the house on the hill, and every now and then, someone claims they see a figure in the window, watching, waiting. If you ever hear a whisper on the wind, a faint, desperate plea for help, turn around. Run. Because the house on the hill has a history, a haunted history that refuses to let go. And now, I'm a part of it. They say that some games should never be played, but once you start, quitting isn't an option. I was 22, just back from college, when I found myself drawn into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. It was the kind of story whispered around bonfires, tales of forbidden games and unbreakable curses. They called it The Devil's Game. It started innocently enough, a night like any other. I was hanging out with my best friend, Jake, and his cousin, Maddie. Jake was one of those people always hungry for an adrenaline rush, always looking for the next thrill to break through the dullness of small-town life. Maddie, on the other hand, was more reserved, but held an insatiable curiosity about all things supernatural. So when Jake mentioned he'd heard about an occult game on some creepy website, her interest was piqued instantly. And mine? Well, I wasn't exactly the type to believe in these things. But something about that night felt different. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, daring us to play. Jake explained the ritual, smirking the entire time. "They call it the Devil's Game," he said, his eyes glinting with excitement. "It's supposed to let you communicate with whatever is on the other side. But there's a catch. You can only ask 3 questions, and you can never stop playing once you start. Otherwise what?" Maddie asked, leaning in, her face pale but intrigued. Jake's grin turned cold. "Otherwise, he comes for you." We laughed it off at first. It all sounded so ridiculous. But as the night wore on, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it. We were bored, and the idea of doing something so reckless and forbidden had an allure we couldn't resist. Around midnight, with nothing but a half-baked plan and a homemade Ouija board scrawled on a piece of cardboard. We found ourselves sitting in the woods, the only light coming from a single candle we'd brought with us. Jake cleared his throat, his voice laced with mock seriousness. "All right, they say to start, you have to draw a circle around yourselves with something sharp. It keeps him from getting too close. And you have to offer something personal, something that holds meaning." He pulled out a silver chain his mom had given him years ago, something he never took off, and placed it in the center of the circle. I took off my grandfather's old watch, a cherished keepsake, and set it beside Jake's necklace. Maddie added a locket containing a picture of her parents. With shaky hands, Jake held a piece of charcoal, drawing a jagged circle around us on the dirt, murmuring words he'd read online. The words sounded foreign, ancient, and for a moment I could have sworn the air itself recoiled from them. We joined hands, feeling more ridiculous than afraid, but when Jake asked the first question, a chill ran down my spine. "Is anyone here with us?" Silence. The forest around us was still, an oppressive quiet settling over the trees, as though they too were waiting. Just when I was about to laugh, something shifted. A faint rustle in the leaves, the quiet snap of a branch in the darkness. My heart pounded, the sound so loud I was sure they could hear it too. Jake's smirk faltered, but he pressed on, his voice shaking. "Are you a spirit?" A soft breeze ruffled the candle's flame, and a shadow flickered across the ground, elongated and unnatural, as though something unseen was lurking just beyond the circle. Maddie gripped my hand tighter, her knuckles white. Is this the devil's game?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the flame turned blue. My stomach dropped. Jake looked at us, his face pale as the words spilled from his lips. "We need to stop now." "But you said we can't," Maddie reminded him, her eyes wide with fear. She glanced around, whispering, "Once you start." Jake tried to blow out the candle, but the flame wouldn't budge. He covered it with his hand, even tried stomping on it, but nothing happened. I could see the panic setting in as he looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "What did we do, man? We just have to finish it," I said, though I wasn't sure where the words came from. "Ask the last question." Jake hesitated, his voice cracking as he asked, "What do you want from us?" The candle's flame surged, casting an eerie glow over the forest. And then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to crawl through the trees and wrap around our ears. A voice, dark and ancient, that sent a shiver through my entire being. "I want what was promised." The ground beneath us shifted, and I felt something cold and clammy wrap around my wrist. Looking down, I nearly screamed. Blackened fingers were creeping out of the earth, clawing their way up, grasping for anything they could reach. Maddie's scream echoed through the forest as a figure, shadowed and featureless, emerged from the darkness beyond the circle. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, piercing into me with a hunger that felt as though it was peeling away my very soul. "Close the circle, close it!" Jake yelled, but it was too late. The thing had breached our feeble protection, moving toward us in jerking, unnatural strides. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs were locked in place, as if I were paralyzed. Jake stumbled backward, breaking the circle, and the figure lunged, faster than any human could move. Maddie tried to pull him back, but the moment she touched him, her hand went limp, her eyes glazing over as if life itself had been sucked out of her. I watched, helpless, as her body collapsed to the ground, her face frozen in terror. "Run!" I managed to scream, finding my voice. Jake and I took off, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind us, growing closer, louder, until they were the only sound in my head. We reached the road, gasping for breath. But when I turned to look back, the figure was gone, and Maddie's body vanished. We didn't speak of that night again, but we never saw Maddie after that. The police searched, the whole town did, but there was no trace. Jake tried to tell them what happened, but they chalked it up to hysteria. A bad prank gone wrong. But I knew better. I could still feel those eyes on me sometimes, watching, waiting. Jake tried to forget, but the shadows had already claimed him. Last year, he took his own life, leaving behind a single note that read, "He's coming." I still hear that voice sometimes, in my dreams, whispering, calling,